Well, how quickly is this year going? I think we've got time just enough to slow it down. Episode 67.
It's time for another show from Colin Jones, the Reasonable Adventurer. Time for you to take another step towards creating your own opportunities for satisfaction.
And it is a huge welcome to episode 67 of the Reasonable Adventurer. I am getting to that stage of the year where I'm seeing a lot less of it left and a lot of it gone. And it's amazing when you actually think about all of those things you want to do and all of that little time that you've got left to get things done in. So it's a bit of urgency starting to creep in into what I'm looking at needs to get done and at least started, so that 2017 is going to sort of shape up as a busy and productive year. So how are you in that space? How are you finding your time? I was at a conference down in Melbourne this week, and it was quite an interesting conference. A lot of people providing a lot of explanation about what it is they do, and that was interesting. And one of the presenters got up and talked about this notion of his organisation's breadth plan and their depth plan in relation to entrepreneurship, education, incubators, accelerators, a whole range of different issues. And I was quite taken by this terminology, the breadth plan and the depth plan for a particular given issue. And I thought, you know what, as I was coming back last night on the plane, as you know from past podcasts, I do like to reflect. And the place that I find it easiest to reflect is on a plane. And I found myself thinking about that statement, and I realised that the actual slickness of the presentation had sort of drawn me in. But actually, what I was more interested in was just the way in which the ideas were organised. I really liked the way in which they were able to sort of wrap up all of their current plans and future plans into this notion of the breadth plan and the depth plan. And as I was reflecting on that coming home yesterday, I couldn't help but think to myself, so what's mine? What's my breadth plan? What's my depth plan? And while I know some of the answers, I think, to this, I don't know all the answers. I mentioned to my boss this morning, I said, it makes me think to myself, where does my job start and where does it end in, say, the context of teaching? But where does it start and where does it end in terms of interacting with people, being of some value to people? It's a really, really interesting question, because the challenge is we get to this stage of the year. It's been a busy time. There are things we haven't got to. There are things we haven't progressed as quickly as we would like. And there are other things that we're now becoming more motivated by. And yeah, okay, we can get rid of the months and just, it's something we're going to do in the foreseeable future, right? But the year will roll around and 2017 will be on us before we know it. And one of the challenges I suspect that we all find is that we do find ourselves becoming all things to all people. Our job gets expanded in terms of the breadth that we're expected to cover. And quite often that can be at the expense of the depth that we would like to achieve in terms of our expertise or interest. So this is a really interesting challenge, a really interesting conundrum, because if you don't know your depth plan and your breadth plan, then quite likely other people don't know it either. And to what extent are you potentially locking yourself out? So there's a bit of humility that's required here. In my space, am I supposed to be someone who has a really good understanding of a whole range of different things? Or am I able to be seen to be an expert on one thing? So in a university environment, we have lots of educators and we have lots of researchers, and sometimes the two things are separate. So if we think about the people who have that opportunity to be researchers. That's what they do. They don't necessarily do a lot of teaching at all, but they really are expected to produce some pretty cool and neat research outcomes. More often than not, they're not sacrificing their depth for their breadth. There's an area that they've got good understanding in, but there's an area where they're absolutely right across everything that's happening. And so this balance between breadth and depth, I suspect in most of our lives, is a pretty critical thing. And I sort of found myself thinking there, I don't think I've got a handle on it. And to the extent that I don't think I've got a handle on it, well, that means that other people don't quite know what to expect from me. It's interesting to contemplate, isn't it? You know, do we need a t-shirt? Do we need a t-shirt that we put on that says, hey, this is how far I'm going in terms of breadth because I really want to go this deep, you know? Versus, don't expect me to be an expert, but having said that, I'm right across this space. You know, I'm happy to interact and have an opinion on everything across this space. So we can't be one or the other, right? We can't just be an expert on essentially nothing, and we can't be somebody who's of value if we want to be all things to all people and ultimately know very little. So it's an interesting challenge. It really is. And I'd love to hear from you guys in terms of what do you think? You know, how does this play through for you? You know, tweet us back and tell us whether you think you've got the balance right. You know, if you think it's right, just say balanced, trying to balance. You know, more breadth than depth, more depth than breadth. It's a curious thing because in any sort of area, whether you're branding your own business, whether you're negotiating with your employer in terms of what 2017 looks like, implicitly there's some notion of your breadth plan and your depth plan. It's in there. We just haven't named it up. We haven't said, I only want to cover this width because I really am desirous of making sure that I can actually get this deep in this area versus I really want to get wider in this area. So don't expect that expertise or a contribution in and around that from me. Now, while the latter's must be less likely than the former, it is a challenge. And if becoming an expert on something is really important to you, then you've got to be able to get that breadth plan under control. If you allow others to stretch you too wide, if you find yourself wandering aimlessly, being connected to this, that, and everything, if you don't yourself recognize what actually are the parameters of your passion and your interest, then it's got to impact on your ability to have the time and the focused energy on that depth plan where you become the expert in something. Now, I think this really matters, and I'll explain more in a second why I think this matters. But it's easy to overlook because, you know, it's now the end of August, and before you know it, the end of the year, and gee, there were some things we didn't get to. Well, that's that process. You know, we talked about it in the quickening back in episode 58. Everything's getting quicker in this world, yeah? Well, it is. And the only way we can slow it down to our satisfaction is to be able to put some parameters up. To be able to say, no, I don't go that far. I only go this far. And, you know, it made me think to myself, people think about, Colin, entrepreneurship. They put the two words together. But entrepreneurship is such a wide space. And there's so many things that happen in that space. And it became very apparent to me when I was in Melbourne that there are a lot of people who have incredible expertise in this space, but not in the actual learning of, the learning area of this space. It's more the process. If you want to get that, then you need to do this to get, that. And that sort of makes me feel, in some ways, insecure that, I don't think I know that process as well as I should. But should I need to know the process? Do I have to know everything? I.e., does the breadth have to be so wide? Or am I better served having that expertise in a smaller area and defining what my involvement in entrepreneurship is, so people understand this is what I do. This is not what I do, right? So it's not to say I'm ignorant of these things. It's just not what I do. How would that play out in your world? How would that play through if you were to admit the limitations of your abilities, your interest, your desire, your passion, so that you could try to communicate better the real areas where you want to be super effective, super engaged, and super able to make a contribution that helps other people? So I said I'd come back to this issue of why I think this matters. We've all got an opportunity, right? We talked about it in episode 63 in Are You Connected? We all got this opportunity to think about something we can do on the side of our desk, right? Now, you remember many, many episodes ago I talked about the hotel efficiency consultant that I met in Germany, and how he was getting tired of traveling, and he still wanted to do his work, but he felt like he just run out of steam in terms of being able to get out there and connect to everybody that he needed to connect to. And over lunch on this rainy day at this tennis club, we started chatting about how he could reach lots and lots of people through a podcast show, through writing ebooks. And it was an avenue that he hadn't thought of. Now, when I look and think back to his situation, I see quite a narrow breadth. He really is just operating in an industry. But I see this amazing depth in terms of all of the efficiency issues that would relate to that industry. So, how does you become that type of an expert that you would be able to turn around and say, I think anyone in the world in the hotel industry would benefit from listening to my podcast or listening to my reading my books? So transfer that into your world. What is it that you're an expert on? What is it that you have a huge passion for? And this could be anything. It doesn't have to be related to commerce. It could be related to helping people understand how to knit. I always mention from time to time our friend Simon Brooks, who wrote a fantastic, simple little book on how to build a pizza oven. There are lots of ways to demonstrate your expertise. But to be able to do that, you do need to be able to step back and redefine the breadth of your existence. You can't say, well, I travel around and I help business people, therefore I'm going to write a book on efficiencies in business, right? Now you've got this massive breadth, so there's lots and lots more potential people you can talk to, but what have you genuinely got to say to these people, other than very basic, obvious advice? If you narrow that breadth back down, and we say it is just the hotel industry, and within that industry, wow, look at this depth. If you're seriously running this hotel, you're going to benefit from understanding some of the ideas that I've got to share with you. So how does that relate into your world? How does that relate to the balance that you have in your life between breadth and depth? It's a very, very interesting question, and I suspect it's something that we don't spend enough time thinking about, because it's just too easy to get caught up. It's too easy to be seduced too. Our egos get sort of dragged into this space, and it's almost like, oh yeah, he's the entrepreneurship guy. What does that mean? What does it mean to be the entrepreneurship guy? Yeah? What does that mean? For the life of me, the more I think about it, the more I think that we are just our own worst enemies. So I've got to try and find a way. And I think I'm going to do next week's podcast on this. So we're going to call this episode, I was going to call it something else, but now I think we'll just call it the Entrepreneurship Guy. Because it sets up next week's episode. Next week, I'm going to go away and think this through even more, so that next week's episode will be the something guy, right? What is it? What am I? What do I want to be known as? Where am I going to set those outer boundaries for my breadth plan? So let me next week share with you my breadth plan, and let me talk to you about the things that I think are lacking in my depth plan. And by bringing in these side barriers, what space am I hopefully trying to create for my depth plan? So let's call this episode 67, a line in the sand, where I no longer want to be called an entrepreneurship guy, because it's easy to be called that when you operate in our space. And therefore people assume you know everything that you need to know about entrepreneurship, which I clearly don't. So this sort of sets the scene, I think. Now I'm getting a bit excited because I've moved into the space where I'm most comfortable, and that is when I've become vulnerable to you. I've made a commitment. I've stepped into a space where I don't quite know the outcome, but I feel quietly confident that I'm going to be better off for having found a way to define this. And of course, by bringing out episode 67 and sending it to my boss and other people in my institution, I'm very publicly releasing my breadth and depth plan. And I think that's important, right? Maybe the next step for me is to create the t-shirt, right? That's maybe what I need to do. And it's not a difficult t-shirt to make, is it? Because you're going to have something that goes out and has boundaries, and you're going to have something that goes down, right? So, maybe we could even have personalised or customised breadth and depth t-shirts. It's a little business we could run, isn't it? Doesn't sound like a bad little one, does it? I suppose it all depends how much people are prepared to pay. Maybe we could test that. Anyway, that's a story for another episode. Until we meet again, when I will reveal to you my breadth and depth plan, having reflected on the issue last night on the plane, discussed it with you, I'll now take some action and reveal and we'll call it an interim depth breadth plan, because of course it's open to change as we move forward, and that's what makes it so interesting and fun. I may want to go deeper. I may want to broaden a little bit, but we'll see. Until then, enjoy your reflections and ask yourself that question: to what extent are you being all things to all people too often, and you need to redefine the scope of your interactions so that you can actually purify and really focus the depth of your interaction in that space. Enjoy your reflecting. Cheerio.